Hi guys, welcome back. What if the hardest part of being a pirate wasn't the battles or the storms, but the long endless months without sex privacy, or women on board life at sea meant cramped decks, no escape, and a crew of men living side by side? Most ships banned women completely, calling them bad luck. Some pirates turned to drink, others to silent arrangements that blurred the line between friendship and desire. There were even partnerships, part emotional, part practical, written right into pirate codes. So how did they survive that kind of isolation? What happened when temptation met loyalty in the middle of the ocean? Tell me when you're watching this, are you sailing through the morning or the dead of night? And if you enjoy history that doesn't shy away from the uncomfortable, subscribe. No pressure, but the next voyage only gets rougher. You climb aboard a pirate ship, and the first thing that hits you isn't fear or excitement, it's the smell. Salt sweat, rotting wood, and a faint tang of rum that's been spilled one too many times. The sea looks beautiful, yes, but the deck? It's a cramped, swaying prison full of men who haven't bathed in weeks, and that's being generous. Imagine living in a locker room where everyone shares one towel and the ocean never stops rocking. Welcome to your new home. Your hammock is wedged between two barrels, each one filled with water that already smells suspiciously like mold. You've got maybe 2 feet of space to yourself. Privacy doesn't exist here. You eat, sleep, and curse beside the same faces every day for months at a time. Now picture this, in that suffocating male-only bubble with no sight of a woman for hundreds of miles. How do you think the human mind starts to bend? That's the quiet part no one writes about in the heroic pirate tales. The loneliness. The ache that gnaws between moments of chaos. You're surrounded by noise, yet starved of affection. Every laugh, every insult, every shove across the deck is a substitute for something softer, something human. The older sailors handle it with gruff humor. Women bring bad luck. They bark partly to sound tough, partly because it's easier than admitting they miss someone's touch. A few pretend the sea itself is enough. She's our mistress, they say. The ocean, wild and unpredictable, becomes a metaphor for desire, dangerous, untamed, always just out of control. But when storms roll in and the ship creaks like it's alive, you realize that this so-called mistress only takes. She never gives. You can't love a thing that might swallow you whole. So you learn to redirect your hunger into other rituals. Food, for example, becomes sacred. A stolen biscuit or a shared mango from a raided port turns into a feast. Rum becomes a form of emotional anesthesia, each sip dulling the ache of months without warmth. And then, of course, there's the sea shanty. Pirates didn't just sing to pass time. They sang to remind themselves they were still human. Every chorus was a small rebellion against the endless isolation. But even the loudest song can't drown out the thought that the only softness on board is the worn rope in your hands. Some sailors joke about it. Others bury the thought under layers of duty and superstition. Keep your hands busy, your heart empty. One captain warns as if loneliness itself were a kind of mutiny. And yet, there's something deeper brewing beneath the jokes and bravado. You start to notice how the men's friendships turn unusually intense. A glance held a second too long, a laugh that lingers. They share secrets, trinkets, sometimes hammocks. It's never discussed aloud, words would ruin it. But it's there, humming beneath the noise of creaking boards and crashing waves. Think of it this way. When you strip away every social rule, every polite disguise, what remains of human connection. Out here, There's no audience, no society watching, just the vast horizon and the men beside you. Some fill that emptiness with prayer, others with rum, and a few with something that doesn't quite have a name. The truth is, most pirates didn't have the luxury of moral philosophy. They lived by a single rule: survive today, worry tomorrow. That meant finding comfort wherever it could be found, whether in a shared song, a loyal crewmate, or the memory of a lover left behind. The historians rarely write about this part because it's messy, intimate, and hard to romanticize. It doesn't fit neatly beside the skull and crossbones or the buried treasure. But if you're going to understand pirates not as legends, but as men, you have to see them as what they were: trapped animals pacing a wooden cage on an endless sea. And maybe, as the moonlight turns the waves silver, you realize the cruelest irony of all. The men who fought kings and defied nations couldn't even escape their own hunger. Not for gold, not for blood, but for connection. You start to realize that on a pirate ship, rules about women weren't just superstition, they were strategy. The sea was already dangerous enough without adding heartbreak and jealousy into the mix. Most captains, whether ruthless or reasonable, agreed on one thing: women on board brought bad luck. But what they really meant was chaos. Imagine being stuck for months in a floating barrel of testosterone with everyone armed, sleep-deprived, and half-drunk. Add a single woman to that equation, and you have the recipe for a mutiny or worse. Some men would turn violent out of desire, others out of envy, and a few out of some twisted sense of protection. So to keep order, captains banned women altogether. They didn't frame it as morality, it was logistics. That didn't stop a few defiant captains from testing fate. Bartholomew Roberts, one of the most infamous pirates of the early 18th century, was known to impose his own strict moral code: no women, no gambling, no stealing from fellow pirates. He'd seen too many crews torn apart by lust and greed. He wasn't wrong. When ships ignored that rule, the stories rarely ended well. Take the tale of Captain Calico Jack Rackham, for instance. His ship broke every rule Roberts ever dreamed of enforcing. Why? Because he sailed with not one but two women disguised as men: Anne Bonny and Mary Read. When their secret was exposed, the crew was stunned. But instead of causing disaster, something unexpected happened. The two women fought, drank, and cursed as fiercely as any man aboard. It wasn't their gender that broke the ship's order. It was everyone else's obsession with it. Still, Anne and Mary were exceptions, not the norm. For every story like theirs, dozens of others ended in blood. A single rumor that a woman had been smuggled aboard could start a fistfight or even a killing. Some captains would rather toss an accused woman overboard than risk unrest among the crew. It sounds cruel, but on a ship where democracy was decided by cutlasses, cruelty was often seen as discipline. But there's a funny twist to all this. No women allowed business. The same men who cursed the idea of having a woman on board would go to great lengths to reach one the moment they made landfall. Ports like Nassau Tortuga and Port Royal were famous not just for trade, but for the unspoken promise of release. So perhaps deep down, the superstition wasn't about bad luck at all. It was about the unbearable tension of wanting something you couldn't have for months on end. You can almost hear the unspoken logic: if temptation can't board, maybe the ship won't burn from the inside out. So they turned that restriction into ritual. They called the sea she the ship her and the wind lady. It was a linguistic trick, a way to fill the void without ever admitting it. You'd hear sailors whisper, "She's angry today," when the waves rose too high, or "She's gentle tonight," when the sky was calm. In some way, every man aboard was already married to the ocean herself. Still, it wasn't a perfect solution. The men grew restless, quick-tempered. Even the smallest disputes over rum or rations could turn ugly. Some crews started inventing strange superstitions to keep themselves in line. For example, whistling on deck was forbidden because it might tempt the wind, or as some said, quietly tempt fate to send a woman among them. The absence of women became almost mythical, something to fear and desire at the same time. And when tempers flared, captains would remind their men the sea gives and the sea takes. It wasn't just poetic. It was a warning that if you let emotion rule, you'd be next to feed the sharks. So the men tried to bury their longings under the rhythm of work, hauling ropes, patching sails, scrubbing decks. But you can only suppress human nature for so long. After all, when the moon hung low and the sea went still, the ship felt less like freedom and more like a monastery with cannons. You start to wonder, was the rule really about keeping order? Or was it a way to deny that even the fiercest pirates were still just men who mistouch warmth and home? As you drift into sleep that night, the ship creaking like an old cradle, you understand why they called it bad luck. It wasn't that women caused chaos. It was that desire itself did. By now, you've learned that pirates didn't just survive storms. In sword fights, they survived each other. When you trap 100 men in a wooden box for months, the line between friend and family begins to blur. They shared everything: food hammocks, fears, and sometimes things that couldn't be labeled so easily. You start noticing it in the smallest gestures. A hand resting on a shoulder a moment too long. Two men quietly carving matching symbols into their pistols. The way one sailor saves a piece of salted beef, only to sneak it to another later. Nobody says it aloud, no one has to. There's a kind of silent code running through the ship stronger than any law of the sea. This is what they called brotherhood. But out here, brotherhood didn't mean what it does on land. It wasn't just loyalty, it was survival through intimacy. When storms hit, you didn't just rely on your mate to pull a rope. You relied on him to pull you back from madness. Imagine being sleepless for days, waves pounding the hull, no horizon in sight, and the only thing that steadies you is the sound of a friend humming beside you. Historians like to romanticize pirate democracy, the votes, the shared plunder, the code of conduct. But that code didn't just divide treasure, it divided loneliness. If one man was wounded, his closest friend would care for him. If one died, his share went to the companion he'd named. Some men even wrote down their wishes: "Give my pistols to him, my coat to him," in a way that reads almost like a will left to a spouse. Now, whether that bond ever crossed into something physical, that's where history gets fuzzy and fascinating. Pirates didn't keep diaries confessing their hearts, but accounts from captured sailors, naval officers, and even colonial governors whispered that the brotherhood of pirates wasn't always purely platonic. The evidence is there between the lines, too discreet to confirm, too consistent to ignore. You might wonder, how did the crew feel about that? Surprisingly, pragmatic. On land, society might have judged. But out here, morality was whatever kept the ship running. If two men were loyal, brave, and useful, no one cared what they shared when the lanterns went out. Besides, when death was always one cannon shot away, who had time for moral lectures One captured sailor from 1720 testified that pirates lived in pairs, sharing loot and bed alike. Some called it companionship, others partnership. But the most telling part was this: there was no shame in it. The sea had stripped away the world's rules, leaving only the law of necessity. Think about it. In a world without privacy, emotion became both weapon and comfort. Jealousy could sink a crew faster than a storm, but affection unspoken steady could keep men alive. It was emotional armor. You might even say the real treasure of pirate life wasn't gold. It was loyalty that ran so deep it blurred every other boundary. Of course, not everyone approved. The Royal Navy mocked pirates as unnatural men, though, ironically, life aboard their own ships wasn't much different. Long voyages, no women, cramped quarters. It all bred the same kind of closeness. The difference was, pirates didn't hide behind hypocrisy. They made their own rules. And maybe that's why the idea of brotherhood became their religion. It filled the spiritual void left by the church they'd abandoned and the families they'd left behind. Every shared secret, every night watch together under the stars became a kind of unspoken vow. When you think of it that way, the pirate ship starts to resemble a floating monastery, except this one prayed to survival, not salvation. The rituals were different, but the longing was the same. To be seen, to belong, to matter to someone in a world that forgot you. As you sway in your hammock, you realize this was the real code of the sea, not the written articles nailed to a mast, but the invisible bond between the men who slept, fought, and laughed side by side. The brotherhood wasn't lawless. It was love disguised as duty. Here's the part they never told you in pirate legends. Some pirates got married, and not to women. It was called matelotage, a word borrowed from the French matelot, meaning sailor. To outsiders, it sounded like a business deal, but on the high seas, it was much more half partnership, half marriage, sealed not by a priest, but by trust. Two men would pledge to share everything: loot, food, a hammock, even inheritance rights. If one died, the other received his belongings. If one was wounded, the other had to care for him. It wasn't romanticized. It was practical, intimate, and surprisingly official. On islands like Tortuga and Hispaniola, where pirate republics sprouted like wild weeds, matelotage became common. Colonial records from the 1600s and 1700s describe dozens of such contracts between sailors. The French governor of Tortuga once complained with theatrical disgust that men there lived together as man and wife. But his disgust reveals something bigger. It wasn't rare. It was normal enough to bother him. Now imagine it from your own perspective. You're a sailor in your 20s, maybe 30s, halfway across the world. No family, no steady home, and no promise of surviving the next battle. Wouldn't you want someone who'd care if you didn't come back from the next raid? Someone who'd guard your share, your memory, maybe even whisper your name when the waves swallowed your ship. That's what matelotage gave them, a small piece of certainty in a life made of chaos. One of the most fascinating cases comes from the Caribbean buccaneers. A chronicler named Alexandre Exquemelin, who actually sailed with them, wrote that pirates kept one another company, and that such bonds were treated like marriage. They'd even refer to each other as my mate or my partner in official ship documents. You could almost picture them carving initials together into the mass symbols of loyalty that would outlast any battle. But don't get it twisted. Not every matelotage was romantic. Some were pure economics. Pairing up doubled your security, doubled your rations, and gave you someone to fight beside. Yet the boundary between affection and convenience was a blur. When you've shared storms, hunger and blood emotion tends to creep in, whether you invite it or not. A few pirate captains reportedly performed ceremonies to bless such unions, nothing holy, just an exchange of pistols or rings, sometimes even a kiss on the cheek. Historians can debate what it meant, but the message was clear: you're not alone anymore. And on a sea where loneliness could drive a man insane, that was worth more than any treasure chest. Still, these arrangements made the colonial powers nervous. To European eyes, the pirate life already represented rebellion against king's laws and God himself. But Matelotage, that was rebellion against nature as they saw it. It blurred the line between commerce and affection, duty and desire, masculine and something else. The irony is delicious. While governments preached morality from marble halls, the pirates, those so-called villains, were practicing their own form of equality. They didn't ask permission to love or partner as they pleased. In their world, survival was the only moral compass, and loyalty was sacred. Think about how radical that was for the 1700s. On land, even whispering such things could get you burned, jailed, or worse. But at sea, where the horizon was your only witness, two men could carve a life together, quietly, fiercely, without apology. If you ever visit the Caribbean today and walk along the ruins of Port Royal, you might wonder how many of those weathered stones once heard laughter from such partnerships. How many mates drank from the same bottle, swore eternal loyalty, then vanished into history, unwritten, unnamed, but deeply human. And when the night deepened, when the rum ran low, and the lanterns flickered, some of them must have stared at each other across that narrow space, and thought the same thing. Maybe freedom wasn't just about gold or blood. Maybe it was about finally choosing who mattered. When the ship finally spotted land, it was like every man aboard had been given a second heartbeat. After months of endless blue, the sight of a coastline, any coastline, was enough to send the deck into chaos. Men who hadn't smiled in weeks started singing. Even the captain's voice softened, because everyone knew what came next: shore leave. For a pirate, shore leave wasn't just rest, it was resurrection. The sea had drained every drop of tenderness from their bodies, and now on land, they were desperate to refill it. The taverns of Nassau, Port Royal, and Tortuga became temples of release. Imagine a world where rum was holy water, laughter a hymn, and music the only law. That's what those nights felt like. You stumble down the gangplank with your crewmates, your legs trembling from months at sea. The air smells different, earthy, humid, full of life. Then the noise hits you. Drums, laughter, the clatter of mugs. Every corner of the port is pulsing with celebration. To the locals, pirates were monsters. To the pirates themselves, this was paradise on borrowed time. You find your way to a tavern called the Broken Anchor, a wooden shack that leans like it's as drunk as its patrons. Inside, pirates from 3 nations drink shoulder to shoulder, roaring sea shanties off-key. The tables are sticky, the candles barely light the room, and nobody cares. Because for once, the crew isn't thinking about survival. They're thinking about pleasure, whatever form it takes. Some gamble throwing coins they've risked their lives for. Others eat until their stomachs ache. And yes, some seek the kind of intimacy they've been denied for months. It's not romance, it's release. It's proof that you're still alive, that you can still feel something other than salt and fear. But here's the cruel trade-off. The more the pirates indulged, the more it cost them. The brothels of Nassau and Havana knew their clientele too well. A pirate might walk in with gold and swagger, but he often limped out, broke sick, and half delirious. Rum blurred the consequences until it was too late. The morning after hangovers mixed with guilt and itching sores, and the surgeon's cabin became a confessional booth without forgiveness. Still, the cycle repeated. Every voyage ended with the same hunger, the same reckless release. It wasn't just about desire, it was about defiance. When the world called them outlaws, they answered by living too loudly, too fiercely. If tomorrow brings the gallows, one pirate joke tonight brings the music. Even those who tried to stay cautious found themselves swept into the madness. Take Blackbeard's men, for example. After months under his brutal command, when they reached port, witnesses described them as wild creatures loosed from hell. They spent fortunes in a single night on rum cards and companionship. For them, tomorrow didn't exist. You can't really judge them, can you? In some way, it's not so different from modern life. People still chase their escapes, weekends, parties, anything, to forget how monotonous survival can feel. The pirates just condensed that cycle into brutal simplicity, months of deprivation, followed by a few days of reckless abundance. It was the same human rhythm, just louder and dirtier. And there was a strange kind of poetry to it. After days of storm and silence, the ports became living dreams. The men laughed until they wept. They danced on tables, their boots thudding like drums of rebellion. In those fleeting hours, they weren't killers or thieves, they were human again. But every night of freedom came with a sunrise of regret. Some men overslept their departure and were left behind stranded in ports that didn't love them back. Others caught diseases that would later spread through the ship like wildfire. And some, in their drunken haze, made promises to women, to friends, to fate, that they'd never remember once the tide called them home. When dawn breaks and the captain's whistle shrieks, you drag yourself back to the ship, bleary-eyed and half-empty. The laughter fades behind you, swallowed by the roar of the sea. The shore grows smaller until it's just a line between water and sky, another memory blurred by rum. And as the sails fill again with wind, the realization hits the ocean, doesn't care what you did last night. She takes you back, without judgment, without mercy. You belong to her now, and she knows your secrets. The morning after shore leave is never quiet. The ship rocks gently, but your stomach doesn't agree. Half the crew is still groaning from the night before, faces pale, eyes hollow, and spirits already back in the gutter. The laughter of the tavern is gone. Now the only sound is the slap of waves and the occasional wretch overboard. But hangovers are the least of your problems. That's when the ship's surgeon earns his keep. Down below deck, the air smells of herbs vinegar and something worse. The doctor, usually a former barber or failed apothecary, works by candlelight sleeves, rolled up hands already stained with old bandages and blood. His tools are simple knives, clamps, leeches, rum, and a sense of dark humor. He's seen everything: gunshot wounds, gangrene, and now the aftermath of too much fun ashore. You limp in, trying not to make eye contact. He doesn't need to ask where you've been. One look at you, and he sighs like a priest who's heard the same sin 100 times. "Nassau, again, eh?" he mutters. You nod, and he reaches for a jar filled with gray powder that smells like burnt metal. You don't ask what it is. You just know it'll burn worse than the regret. This was the hidden tax of pirate pleasure disease, the kind they never mentioned in sea shanties. Scurvy might rot your gums, but this one ate at pride. The sailors called it the pox, though it went by many names: French Spanish, or simply the devil's gift. And aboard a pirate ship, it spread faster than rumor. Once infected, a man's world shrank to the surgeon's corner. There was no cure-only treatment that hurt as much as the sickness. Mercury ointment was the favorite remedy, a poison to fight a poison. The doctor would smear it across sores, then tell the patient to sweat it out. Some did. Others didn't. But even beyond disease, the surgeon's cabin became a kind of emotional dumping ground. It was where broken bodies and secrets ended up together. You'd hear the confessions whispered between coughs, promises made to women in Tortuga, children left in Havana, lies told to friends who'd never return. The sea had stripped them of modesty. The doctor stripped them of illusion. Sometimes he'd talk just to fill the silence. You boys treat life like a bottle, he'd say, cleaning a blade. You drink till it's empty, then curse when it's gone. No one argued with him. Pirates didn't like mirrors, especially the kind made of words. It wasn't all tragic, though. There was a strange camaraderie in that misery. The same men who'd once boasted of their conquests now helped each other recover. They joked through the pain, mocked each other's limp walks, even brought stolen fruit as peace offerings. Laughter became medicine when nothing else worked. Some captains tried to enforce stricter rules after disastrous shore leaves. No woman, no rum, no regret, they'd say. But those orders never lasted long. The sea demanded discipline. The heart demanded chaos, and chaos usually won. One ship's log from 1718 recorded a remarkable entry. Half the crew laid up sick. Surgeon complains of exhaustion. Captain declares next port visit will be for water only. 2 weeks later, that same log noted crew, gone ashore in good spirits. History, it seems, has always been allergic to self-control. The doctor himself became a kind of confessor priest of the ocean. Men feared him, but trusted him. He was the keeper of everyone's mistakes. Some even came to him, not for wounds, but for advice. "How do you stop missing the shore?" one asked. The doctor shrugged. "You don't. You just stop admitting it." That's the cruel genius of the pirate life. It taught denial as survival. Every illness, every scar, every regret was treated like an inconvenience, patched over and ignored until the next storm hit. There was no time for reflection when death could come with the next wave. And yet in those dim corners of the ship where the surgeon's candle burned, you could see the truth flicker across every face, all their defiance, all their swagger. It was just a mask over the same fragile longing, the kind that no medicine could cure. By the time you leave the cabin, the ocean looks the same as always, calm, endless, indifferent. But you know something's changed. You've seen the cost of pretending that desire has no consequence. And as the wind fills the sails once more, you can't help wondering how many of these men will still be alive the next time the ship reaches port. The sea has a way of talking back when you've been alone too long. You start hearing it in the creak of the timbers, the moan of the wind through the rigging, the endless slap of water against the hull. It starts to sound like voices, whispers, sometimes laughter. The ocean becomes a choir, and you're never sure whether it's comforting or mocking you. After months at sea, the human mind starts to bend like wet rope. The world shrinks to the rhythm of tides and the heartbeat of the ship. The faces around you blur into one another. The horizon never changes. Some men call it the sailor's madness. Others simply call it the hush. Whatever the name, it's what happens when you've been staring at nothing for too long. You try to stay busy, patching sails, polishing your pistol, counting the same pile of gold coins over and over. But the silence always comes back. It seeps into your dreams. You wake up sweating, thinking you've heard someone calling your name. And that's when the stories begin. The older sailors talk about the sea devil. They say he comes for men who've forgotten what a woman's voice sounds like. He takes the form of a beautiful creature, sometimes a mermaid, sometimes a ghostly woman floating on the waves. At first, he calls softly, promising warmth, comfort, maybe even love. But the moment a sailor reaches for him, he drags them under. It's not a bedtime tale, it's a metaphor wearing seaweed. The longer you're at sea, the more your desires start to look like hallucinations. Superstition became a survival mechanism. The men needed something to explain the ache in their chest, the longing that had nowhere to go. They blamed the sea devil, the sirens, the full moon, anything but their own loneliness, because to admit that you were simply craving touch or tenderness was unthinkable. Better to believe a demon tempted you than to say out loud, "I'm lonely." It sounds silly now, but even the most hardened captains weren't immune. Some refused to sail under a full moon, fearing the call. Others banned sea shanties about love, claiming they awakened old ghosts. One notorious pirate, Edward Lowe, was said to have gone mad after insisting he'd seen a woman swimming alongside his ship at night, her face pale as salt. The crew swore the next morning he was quieter, gentler, until he wasn't. Isolation does strange things. When every day looks the same, memory becomes a kind of mirage. You start remembering touches that never happened, voices that never existed. You see patterns in the stars and faces in the foam. And the worst part of you starts wanting it to be haunted just so you're not alone. Sometimes the ship's parrot or the occasional stray cat became the crew's emotional anchor. One pirate named Black Sam Bellamy reportedly carried a pet monkey and treated it better than most captains treated their men. Maybe it wasn't sentimentality. Maybe it was sanity. When the only soft thing you've seen for months is a rope fur starts to feel like grace. You catch yourself staring too long at the moon, tracing the reflection of light across the waves. It moves like a woman's hand, graceful and unreachable. You blink, but it's still there. Maybe the sea devil isn't real, but loneliness is, and that's worse. Even the toughest pirates developed strange little rituals to cope. Some whispered prayers they'd long stopped believing in. Others carved charms into the mass little symbols meant to keep the madness away. You find yourself doing it, too, etching tiny marks just to prove you exist. Every scratch in the wood becomes a conversation with the silence. Modern psychologists might call it sensory deprivation or isolation trauma. Back then, the pirates just called it the curse of the deep. Some laughed it off. Others didn't make it home to tell the tale. And yet, amid all that madness, something beautiful happens. The sea strips you down to your simplest truths. You realize how fragile you are, how easily longing can twist into faith or fear. The pirates didn't have therapists or journals. They had each other, and the occasional hallucination that reminded them they still wanted to be loved. So when the storm clouds gather and you swear you hear singing beneath the wind, you stop asking whether it's real. You just listen. Because sometimes that haunting melody is the only thing keeping you human. You'd think a ship with a strict no women rule would make that policy simple. But history, like the sea, loves exceptions. and none were more startling than the women who disguised themselves as men to live fight and sail among pirates. You'd never spot them at first. They were too good at pretending. But sooner or later, truth has a way of revealing itself in the heat of battle or the quiet of night. The most famous of them were Anne Bonny and Mary Read, two women who tore through the Caribbean in the early 1700s, dressed as men cursing like devils and fighting like thunder. They didn't join piracy for love of gold or violence. They joined because the world on land had no place for women who refused to kneel. You can almost imagine their laughter cutting through the chaos of cannon fire, sharp, fearless, free. Anne Bonny's story began in scandal. Born in Ireland, raised in the colonies, she was fiery enough to stab a servant before she was 13. When her father tried to marry her off, she ran away with a sailor named Calico Jack Rackham and joined his crew disguised as a man. No corsets, no lace, just a pistol on each hip and a heart that refused to obey. Mary Read's path was stranger still. She'd been raised pretending to be a boy by her mother, who needed to claim an inheritance. By the time Mary joined the army and later piracy, living as a man was second nature. The disguise wasn't deceit, it was survival. When Anne and Mary met aboard Rackham's ship, they recognized each other's secret. Some say they became lovers. Others say they were sisters in rebellion. Whatever the truth, they fought side by side until the bitter end. When Rackham's crew was finally captured in 1720, the men begged for mercy. But Anne and Mary fought until their weapons broke. Witnesses swore that their fury put every man on deck to shame. At their trial, both were sentenced to hang, but they claimed to be pregnant, a delay tactic that worked at least for a while. Mary died in prison of fever. Anne simply vanished from the records. Some say her father ransomed her. Others believe she escaped and lived quietly under a new name. But part of you likes to think she never stopped fighting, that she found another ship, another horizon. These women weren't just anomalies. They were a quiet rebellion against every law written by men. On pirate ships, where survival mattered more than gender, they found a twisted kind of equality. No one cared who you were, only whether you could load a cannon or swing a cutlass without hesitation. That alone made piracy more progressive than most kingdoms of its time. But their presence also complicated the fragile balance on board. For all their talk of freedom, pirates were still human, with all the jealousy and desire that came with it. When a woman's identity was discovered, it could throw the ship into turmoil, some men drawn to her, others furious at the deception. To keep peace, some captains quietly looked the other way. They'd pretend not to notice that one sailor's voice was higher, that one pair of hands was smaller. Denial became another form of discipline. Yet beneath that denial, something revolutionary was brewing. In a world obsessed with labels, man, woman, sinner, saint, the pirates blurred them all. They proved that strength wasn't masculine, that loyalty wasn't gendered, that freedom was something you lived, not something you were granted. And think about it, how many more went unnoticed? The seas were vast, the records incomplete. For every Anne or Mary, there may have been others whose stories drowned with their ships. A whisper. Here, a rumor there, a name carved into driftwood. The ocean keeps its secrets well. Modern historians have tried to romanticize these figures, painting them as wild temptresses or feminist icons before their time. But the truth is simpler and more powerful. They were people who refused to live small. People who traded the safety of obedience for the danger of freedom. When you picture Anne standing on the deck, hair whipping in the wind pistol, raised against a navy twice her size, you realize she wasn't just fighting for her life. She was fighting for the right to exist on her own terms. And in that moment, the sea itself must have been proud. Power changes everything, even desire. On a pirate ship, where life was decided by strength and charisma, the captain's authority wasn't just political, it was psychological. The same man who could command loyalty with a glance could also bend it into fear, and sometimes into something darker. You begin to see it when a captain's temper turns from charm to cruelty. He doles out punishments that sting more than the lash, forcing a sailor to kneel to obey to break. Discipline was essential at sea, but some captains learned to enjoy it too much. It wasn't always about maintaining order. Sometimes it was about reminding everyone that power and humiliation were siblings. History doesn't flinch here, it whispers. Take Captain Edward Lowe, a name spoken like a curse in every port. He was infamous for his sadism, not just in battle, but among his crew. He'd smile while punishing a sailor, not for mutiny, but for glancing at him the wrong way. His men feared him more than the gallows. Some historians even suggest his cruelty masked a twisted intimacy control was his only form of affection. Or look at Blackbeard, who played God with his image. He tied burning fuses into his beard so that smoke wreathed his face like a demon's halo. He'd stand close to his men, daring them to meet his gaze, testing their courage. He wasn't just leading them. He was performing dominance, every breath, a reminder that his power was theatrical, personal, and absolute. On most ships, relationships between officers and crew blurred the line between protection and possession. The captain chose who shared his quarters, who got extra rations, who stood nearest in battle. The chosen gained privilege, but also scrutiny. A friendship with the captain could feel like a noose made of silk, comfortable but tightening with every favor. You might think pirates were wild and lawless, but even their freedom had hierarchies. Desire became currency. Obedience was its price. When a man held another's fate in his hands, affection could twist into domination without either of them realizing it. The sea didn't change human nature, it just stripped away the pretense. And then there were the punishments that blurred into theater. Public humiliation kept order, but it also fed something primal in both the punished and the watcher. A man whipped for stealing rum might endure it with stoic pride, his eyes locked on his captain's, daring him to feel shame. There's a strange intimacy in that kind of suffering, the silent exchange of power, pride, and pain. But the pirate world wasn't entirely cruel. Some captains understood the delicate balance between fear and respect. Captain Charles Vane, for instance, was known to rule through charisma rather than terror. He punished when he had to, but he also protected fiercely. To his crew, loyalty wasn't demanded, it was earned. For those rare leaders, power became a bond, not a weapon. Still, even in the best of ships, authority carried temptation. The isolation, the adrenaline, the blurred boundaries of rank, it created a kind of emotional fever. There were unspoken rules about proximity, how long you could stand beside someone before it meant something, how close you could sleep before it looked suspicious. On land, you could walk away from awkwardness. At sea, there was nowhere to go. The crew whispered about favoritism, jealousy, even secret liaisons. It didn't matter whether the rumors were true. What mattered was that they existed. Gossip was another form of survival, a way to explain the strange intimacy of power. And if someone crossed the line, whatever that line happened to be, the punishment was swift. Sometimes it was flogging, sometimes marooning, and sometimes something far more humiliating. But every act of discipline echoed the same truth on a pirate ship. The boundary between dominance and devotion was razor thin. You can't help but notice the irony. These men had fled kingdoms to escape tyranny only to recreate it on their decks. They rejected kings but built smaller thrones of their own. The difference was that at sea, power was always temporary. The moment a captain pushed too far, the crew could mutiny, and they often did. So when you watch the captain pacing the deck, boots clicking like a judge's gavel, you see the paradox of pirate freedom in motion. They fought to live without masters, but couldn't resist becoming them. They defied every rule the world made except the oldest one, the hunger to control, to be wanted to be obeyed. The wind howls through the rigging that night, and the captain's lantern glows like a single star on the dark sea. You realize then that power and desire have always shared a cabin, and on this ship, neither ever sleeps. They called it freedom, but maybe what they were really chasing was permission to feel. As the ship cuts across the dark horizon, the men around you are quiet for once. No shanties, no laughter, just the sigh of the wind through torn sails and the heavy breathing of exhaustion. Months at sea have stripped everyone down to the raw truth. Even the fiercest pirates weren't built for endless freedom. Beneath the bravado, they were just people trying to outrun loneliness laws and the limits of being human. You lean against the railing, staring into the black water below. It looks infinite, just like the word freedom must have sounded when they first muttered it. But out here, you realize freedom isn't the same as peace. It's wild, hungry, and restless. It gives you everything and takes twice as much. Think of how it began. Men fleeing monarchies, prisons, and poverty, looking for a place with no masters. They found it, but they also found silence. And in that silence, desire began to echo louder than cannon fire. They outlawed women-invented brotherhoods, carved metallage vows, and sought comfort where they could. It wasn't depravity, it was adaptation. They weren't sinners, they were survivors. The sea demanded new definitions for everything. Love became loyalty. Marriage became partnership. Lust became loneliness with a rum chaser. And even the most hardened pirate, the one who swore he needed no one, would sometimes wake from a nightmare and reach into the dark, half hoping for another hand. You start thinking of all the stories that never made it into the history books, the quiet ones. The men who died, not in glorious battles, but in hammocks, whispering someone's name. The women who wore men's clothes, not to deceive, but to exist. The doctor who patched bodies and hearts in equal measure. The captain who punished out of fear because affection scared him more than mutiny ever could. It's easy to judge them now, to wrap their lives in words like infamous or immoral. But those words are too small for people who lived without maps. They were flawed, desperate, brilliant, and brutally alive. They built their own world, one plank and one heartbeat at a time. And in doing so, they exposed something we still haven't solved: how to live free without losing our humanity. You glance at the stars. They look close enough to touch, yet impossibly distant. Maybe that's what freedom feels like. The pirates reached for it with both hands, knowing it would burn them, but they reached anyway. Because even if the world called them monsters, they chose to live by their own code. And what was that code really? Not just take what you can, or give nothing back. It was never about gold alone. It was about claiming the right to want food, laughter, touch, belonging without shame. To live outside every rule that said who you could love or what you should need. So maybe the story of pirates isn't one of sin, but of honesty. They tore away society's disguise and faced the raw truth of being human in its most unfiltered form. They weren't noble, but they were real. And that perhaps is what frightened the world most. As dawn breaks, the sea turns silver again. You hear a low hum rise from the deck, a song rough and off-key, but somehow tender. The same men who plundered ships now sing about home, about brothers lost to the waves, about women who may or may not have existed. The sound carries over the water like a confession. You close your eyes and let it wash over you. The voices blur into the wind until you can't tell where the men end and the ocean begins. And for a fleeting moment, you understand what all those rules, taboos, and superstitions were trying to hide. The pirates weren't afraid of the sea. They were afraid of what it revealed, the hunger, not just for flesh, but for meaning, for touch, for belonging. So the next time someone tells you, pirates were savages, remember this, they were also dreamers. They sought freedom so completely that it broke them. And in their ruin, they showed us the oldest truth of all. No matter how far you sail, you never escape the need to be loved. Months trapped at sea twisted pirates into restless, lonely men craving freedom, touch, and meaning in equal measure. Their brotherhood blurred lines between loyalty and desire, revealing how isolation reshaped human need. But when women did enter their world, that hunger turned dark. Now you're about to uncover the horrifying truth about what pirates did to captured women. Black sails. That's the first thing you see, sharp triangles slicing through the horizon like the teeth of some ancient sea beast. The wind stops playing, the sea holds its breath, and suddenly your merchant ship feels more like a coffin made of oak. You can almost hear the crew's hearts hammering beneath their shirts as the lookout yells one word that makes everyone's stomach drop. Pirates. And not the movie kind who wink and juggle parrots. These are the ones who smell of gunpowder, sweat, and something that used to be rum 3 weeks ago. You stand on deck as chaos unfolds. Sails, snap ropes whip, and the captain's voice cracks trying to sound brave. The women on board merchants' wives and passengers bound for the New World huddle together like startled doves. A few still clutch rosaries, others just close their eyes and pray the pirates might take the gold and leave the rest. Spoiler, they won't. Pirates didn't waste good plunder. And to them, a captured woman was a prize worth more than silver. The sea, after all, had no witnesses. As the black flag rises, skull and bones grinning against the sun, you realize how calculated this terror is. That flag wasn't just decoration. It was psychological warfare. It promised no mercy. Many ships surrendered at the sight of it, hoping to avoid bloodshed. But surrender didn't mean safety. It only meant survival would cost something else. You can almost smell the mix of salt and fear the sharp metal tang of blades being drawn. The merchant captain lowers his flag, and the pirates cheer a chorus of triumph that sounds more animal than human. When the pirates finally board, it's fast like a storm with knives. Some shout in English, others in French or Spanish, their laughter echoing as they tear through the cargo. Barrels of sugar, gold coins, silks, spices, and then their eyes fall on the women. You notice the shift immediately. The laughter grows quieter, more deliberate. The pirates begin to circle. One of them, tattooed from neck to wrist, tips his hat with mock politeness and says, "Well now, what treasure have we here?" You suddenly understand that for these men, plunder isn't just about money, it's about dominance. It's unsettling how routine it all seems. No one hesitates, no one objects. History often paints pirates as free-spirited rebels, but here you see something closer to organized cruelty. They were businessmen of fear. Women were spoils, the human equivalent of a captured ship. In some cases, captains even kept ledgers where women were listed alongside barrels of rum and crates of tobacco. And yes, those records existed, grim proof that this wasn't chaos. It was commerce. You might wonder, weren't there any pirate codes or rules? Oh, there were. Articles of conduct carefully written to maintain order among thieves. But those noble-sounding rules rarely applied to captives, especially women. To the pirates, women were outside the law, outside the brotherhood. Power meant permission, and mercy was considered weakness. In some twisted way, they believed the ocean absolved them. Whatever happened at sea stayed at sea. Imagine for a moment the sounds aboard that ship after victory coins, clinking drunken shouts, the creak of timbers, and beneath it all muffled sobs. The world above decks celebrated while below fear grew roots. Some pirates justified it, saying women brought luck or comfort on long voyages. That word comfort has a dark history that stretches far beyond this moment. You'll see it echo again centuries later in war, always meaning the same thing: control, disguised as care. But for now, you're here watching as the sea glitters deceptively beautiful under the sun. The same sun that shines on both cruelty and calm. You realize that in the world of pirates, storms weren't just weather, they were choices. And this one has only begun. You'd think after the chaos of a raid, there'd be a pause, a moment for everyone to breathe, to sort out what's left. But pirates didn't work like that. Once the cannon smoke cleared, and the last frightened sailor dropped his weapon, a new ritual began dividing the spoils. And just like gold, silver, and rum, women were now part of the inventory. They called it the division of plunder, and it was both methodical and grotesque. You watch as the quartermaster, a man whose job was to ensure fairness, ironically enough, lays out the shares. The captain gets 2 or 3 portions, officers 1.5, the crew 1 each. And then someone laughs and gestures toward the trembling captives. "What about them?" he says. The answer is silence first, then cruel chuckling. No one needs to explain that this kind of plunder doesn't get written in the ledger. It's the unspoken bonus. For the women, it's a lottery without winners. Some are claimed by rank captains, often exercised, first pick, a privilege that was both coveted and feared. Others are traded between men like poker chips, or used to settle debts. You see the way one pirate grins as he wins a woman in a dice game. There's a kind of sick economy here, one that treats human beings as negotiable property. You'd almost think Wall Street was founded on a ship like this. There's a strange order to the disorder. Pirates might appear as chaotic drunks, but they ran their floating societies with frightening efficiency. Everything had a price, even people. And the way they justified it, they said, "We're at sea. The law doesn't reach here." The ocean was their loophole, and cruelty their currency. You might ask, did all pirates behave this way? Not every single one. There were exceptions, rare as pearls, where some captains forbade harming captives. The infamous Black Bart Roberts, for instance, enforced strict rules about women on his ship, calling such behavior unmanly. But those exceptions were like raindrops in a drought, statistically irrelevant against the flood of brutality that defined the age. It's disturbing how quickly loot became life. You can feel the shift in atmosphere laughter mingling with fear boots stomping on wet planks the creak of the mast, as though even the ship itself disapproved. Some women tried to appeal to reason, offering ransoms pleading for mercy, but reason was a rare commodity aboard pirate decks. Compassion didn't yield profit. And yet you can't help but notice the contradiction. Pirates, the supposed champions of freedom, enslaving others without hesitation. They sang songs about liberty, defying kings and empires, but within their wooden kingdoms, tyranny ruled. Freedom for them only existed when it came at someone else's expense. If irony had a national flag, it would have been stitched from these sails. Sometimes deals were made. Wealthy captives could buy protection or illusion of it. A woman who promised ransom might be reserved, given to the captain until payment arrived. It sounds civilized until you realize what reserved meant. Most of those ransoms never came. The ocean has a way of swallowing letters and promises alike. And there's another layer here: alliances. Pirates often traded women to friendly ships or coastal black markets. Port officials, smugglers, even local governors sometimes accepted such gifts in exchange for safe harbor. You begin to understand how systemic the cruelty was. It wasn't random violence, it was a network. Somewhere on deck, a bottle smashes. Laughter breaks out. The quartermaster raises his voice to tally shares, pretending everything is equal and just. But you can see the truth behind the numbers. Gold can be weighed. Jewels can be counted. But human suffering never makes it to the manifest. The night falls, and the division ends. The pirates are drunk, singing shanties about luck and love, as if either existed in their world. The women sit apart, silent shadows in the lantern light, staring into the sea that once symbolized escape. You wonder what it must feel like to realize that freedom and danger are now the same thing. And as the waves slap against the hull, you sense that the worst part isn't the violence, it's the normalization of it. The idea that this is just how things are done. Because once cruelty becomes routine, it stops shocking anyone. It just becomes business. If you've ever heard someone romanticize the honor among thieves, this is where you'd like to hand them a bucket of seawater and say, "Really, you sure about that?" Pirates love to brag about their codes, their democratic rules, their fairness, their brotherhood. On paper, it sounded almost utopian. Everyone got a vote. Loot was divided equally. Even injuries had compensation. Lose a leg, you got paid. Lose your freedom. Well, that depended on your gender. You walk among the crew as they gather under the moonlight to recite their so-called articles. A parchment pinned to the mast lists their sacred laws: no stealing from your mates, no deserting during battle lights, out at 8 bells. It's like a floating version of the 10 Commandments, except someone quietly erased the parts about basic humanity. Because as you soon see, the pirate code stopped at the moment a woman was captured. The ink didn't cover them. The men puff out their chests, proud of their orderliness. One even claims, "We're more civilized than the Navy." And he's not entirely wrong. Pirate democracy really did exist: voting shares, even health insurance of a sort. But when it came to captives, the democracy dissolved faster than rum on deck. They justified it by calling women spoils of war, part of the reward system that kept morale high. A grim kind of motivational program if you think about it. Some captains went further, writing private rules that openly contradicted their official codes. Captain Edward Lowe, notorious even among pirates, supposedly allowed anything his men wanted as long as it didn't cause mutiny. Liberty, he called it. You stand there staring at that word, realizing how twisted freedom sounds when it's built on someone else's captivity. And yet, there's irony floating in the air thicker than gun smoke. Many pirates themselves were once slaves, sailors whipped by naval officers, men who fled brutality only to recreate it at sea. It's like humanity couldn't outrun its own shadow. The oppressed becoming oppressors, history's favorite plot twist. Sometimes a new recruit would hesitate, questioning what was happening to the women. But the sea has a way of drowning guilt. Peer pressure aboard a pirate ship was as strong as the tides. One man's silence became another's permission. And over time, conscience was replaced by ritual. The ship became its own moral universe, isolated and self-justifying. Out here, no law of God or country applied, only the captain's. You can almost hear the contradictions creak in the wood. Pirates toasted to liberty while locking others in darkness. They spoke of justice while dividing the helpless. And the strangest part, they saw no hypocrisy in it. When men live too long without accountability, the mind starts to warp. The sea becomes a mirror, but it reflects only what you choose to see. Occasionally you'd hear a pirate quote the code like scripture. No man to strike another in anger, one recites proudly right before dragging a woman by the hair for resisting. The absurdity hangs in the air like mist. If someone protested, they risked being labeled soft, even mutinous. And mutiny, well, that was punishable by death, or worse, marooning. So everyone looked away. You wonder, how does a society, even one of criminals, sustain itself on contradictions? The answer lies in fear and convenience. It was easier to believe that women were objects, not people. Objects don't accuse. They don't haunt you in dreams. They don't ask questions like, what would your mother think? That's why pirates called their captives cargo. It wasn't just dehumanizing. It was anesthetic. It numbed the mind. Still, some captains took their code seriously to a fault. Bartholomew Roberts, the one who refused to keep women on board, actually punished any man caught harming a captive. He was an exception that proved the rule, the rare moment when decency flickered in an otherwise dark sea. But even he couldn't control every crew member, every storm, every night, when discipline drowned in rum. By dawn, the code is back on the mast, fluttering proudly, as if it meant something noble. The men laugh, drink, and call themselves righteous rebels. The women remain below deck, out of sight, out of the articles, out of history's protection. And as the sails billow in the wind, you realize something chilling. Civilization itself isn't the absence of cruelty. It's just the pretense of rules. The pirates only removed the pretense. You've probably heard of pirate brides, those romanticized tales where a fearless rogue falls for a beautiful captive and protects her from the rest of the crew. Let's be honest, that wasn't love. That was ownership, wrapped in poetry, and history has been kind enough to call it marriage. You stand on the deck, one humid night, as the captain, an aging man with gold rings on every finger, announces that he's taking one of the captured women as his wife. The crew cheers not out of joy, but relief. Claiming a woman meant she was spoken for, and therefore temporarily safe from everyone else. Temporary being the key word. The woman stands motionless, her face blank, as if her mind has already left the ship. The captain drapes his coat over her shoulders like a crown of authority. Somewhere below deck, someone laughs bitterly. They called it a sea marriage, but it had nothing to do with vows or faith. It was survival disguised as ceremony. Some women accepted these forced unions because the alternative was worse if belonging to one man could spare them from the violence of many. Then it was a grim kind of logic. You might even say it was the cruelest form of protection, the kind that looks like mercy, but isn't. This wasn't rare. Reports from the Caribbean to the South China Sea tell the same story: captains and officers taking wives for weeks, sometimes months, before abandoning or trading them at the next port. They justified it with language that made it sound almost noble. "She is under my care," they'd say, as if claiming someone erased the crime. It's the same excuse history repeats over and over whenever power meets vulnerability. One of the most infamous examples was Captain John Phillips of the Revenge, who married a young Irish woman captured near Newfoundland. He gave her a necklace, paraded her before his men, and forbade anyone to touch her. For a moment she was treated as royalty, but royalty on a sinking throne. Weeks later, when she fell ill, Phillips lost interest. She was left behind on a deserted coast, her name never recorded. You can almost hear the ocean reclaiming her story, wave by wave. Sometimes, though, the tables turned. There are whispers of women who used these forced marriages to their advantage, listening, observing, surviving long enough to plan escape. A few even became informants for authorities once they reached shore. Others, like the mysterious Anne Godfrey, turned the illusion of marriage into actual power, becoming partners in crime with their captors. History can be twisted, but it also has a dark sense of irony. Still, the majority of women weren't so lucky. The psychological toll of these unions was immense. Imagine waking up every day pretending to smile at the person who stole your freedom. Pretending affection was easier than facing punishment. In a way, these women became actresses in their own survival dramas, performing tenderness to stay alive. Some wrote letters. Others sang old songs from home, small acts to remind themselves they once had lives beyond the sea. You think of how this mirrors situations, even in modern times, relationships born out of dependency or fear. People calling captivity love because the world offers no better name for it. The setting may change, the uniforms and weapons might vanish, but the pattern remains: power always finds a way to disguise itself as affection. Among pirates, these so-called marriages also served another purpose. They prevented mutiny. A crew, distracted by personal shares, was less likely to rebel. Love, or the illusion of it, became another tool of control. Even in chaos, the pirates knew psychology. Give men possession, and they'll call it loyalty. Give them guilt, and they'll call it romance. By dawn, you see the new bride sitting alone near the bow, staring at the horizon. The captain is asleep in his quarters, snoring over a pile of coins. She doesn't cry. She doesn't move. The sea glitters around her, mocking her stillness. Somewhere, a gull screams overhead, its sound sharp as a tear that refuses to fall. You wonder if she's counting the waves or the hours until the next port. Either way, the tide always wins. You descend the ladder into the ship's belly, the air growing thicker with every step. The scent hits first salt sweat rum, and something older, like rusted chains and damp wood. Down here, the light can't find you. Lanterns sway weakly, their glow more like a memory than illumination. This is where the women are kept. Not in cabins or quarters, but in the same space as the barrels of rum and the sacks of flour, because to the pirates, that's what they were: supplies. The floorboards are slick. and every creak feels like the ship groaning in sympathy. You see them huddled together, some asleep, some whispering prayers, others staring blankly into the dark. The youngest can't be more than 15. You'd think being below deck would mean safety, but here it's just another kind of danger. The crew comes and goes, and the women learn to make themselves invisible. They talk in hushed tones, their voices trembling with the rhythm of the waves above. There's no clock here, no sunlight, so time dissolves. Days blur into nights, and nights into nightmares. Some women carve tiny marks into the wood to count the days, though none seem sure what they're counting toward rescue death, or just the hope of being remembered. You notice one mark shaped like a bird. Maybe she dreamed of flying. Occasionally, the hatch opens, and the pirates throw down leftovers, bread gone hard salted meat, or the bottom of a rum bottle. To the crew, it's charity. To the captives, it's survival. You can almost hear the ocean laughing outside, as if mocking the idea of mercy. The sound of footsteps on the deck above becomes the new heartbeat of this world. When it pauses, everyone below holds their breath. One woman hums a tune, barely audible, a lullaby from home perhaps. It floats through the stale air like a ghost of peace. Others join softly, creating a fragile harmony that doesn't belong in this place. For a moment, the hold feels human again, but it never lasts. A pirate's shout above a clatter of boots, and the song dies mid-note. You realize that silence is their only real defense. The cruelty of the hold wasn't always deliberate. It was also neglect. Pirates were not equipped to care for captives. Food spoiled, water grew foul, and sickness spread faster than rumor. In some records, entire groups of women perished at sea from disease or dehydration, their bodies tossed overboard with the same indifference as a broken crate. No ceremony, no prayer, just the splash and the smell of salt. You can't help thinking of how this mirrors other parts of history, places where people were confined in darkness and told to be grateful for survival. The conditions on these ships weren't far from prison ships or slave galleons, except here, the cruelty wore the grin of freedom. The irony stings men who claim to flee oppression at home, turn the open sea into their own empire of cages. Sometimes storms would roll in, shaking the ship like an angry god. The women clung to the beams as waves crashed overhead, praying the sea might swallow everything. When the storm passed, a strange quiet followed, a reminder that even nature had more mercy than the men above. You watch as they lie back, drenched in sweat hair, clinging to their faces, whispering names you don't recognize. Names of mothers, lovers, children, anchors to a world they might never see again. There's a small irony you can't ignore. Many pirates believed the sea was alive, a spirit that punished greed. They'd toss coins into the water for luck, whispering apologies to it before a raid. Yet here they were hiding their sins in the belly of their ship, thinking the ocean didn't notice. Maybe it did. Maybe every storm was its way of remembering. If you listen closely, you can still hear the rhythm of that hidden world, the faint creak of wood, the drip of water from above, the murmurs of women who refuse to vanish quietly. Down here, life isn't measured in hours or meals, but in endurance. Every breath taken in that darkness was a small rebellion, a whisper to the world above, I am still here. You might think by now that hope had long drowned somewhere between the barrels and the bilge water, but the human spirit has a strange way of resurfacing where it's least expected. Not everyone bowed to fear. Some women, exhausted but unbroken, decided that survival didn't mean silence. And sometimes Resistance came in forms so small, they'd seem invisible to anyone who wasn't looking closely. It starts with whispers. Not just prayers, but plans. You hear it in the corners of the hold, when the crew is too drunk to notice the exchange of words like knife key storm. Tiny conspiracies of defiance. Some women use the pirates' arrogance against them, flattering their egos, gaining their trust, memorizing routines. Others hide scraps of metal bits of glass, anything that could be turned into a tool or a weapon. You realize that desperation sharpens the mind faster than any blade. There are stories, true ones of captives who waited for the perfect moment. One night, when the watchman fell asleep, two women pried open the hatch using a loose nail and climbed onto the deck. They didn't make it far, but they jumped overboard before they could be caught. The sea took them, but at least it was their choice. In a world where everything was stolen from them, choosing how to die was the last act of control they had left. Others chose to fight back from within. There's a recorded account of a Spanish woman named Maria, captured off Havana, who poisoned the crew's rum with crushed berries from the cargo hold. The pirates blamed bad luck. She called it divine justice. She didn't live long after that, but her name survived in whispers through the ports of the Caribbean. Funny how rebellion has better memory than cruelty sometimes. And then there were the disguises. A few women cut their hair, stole men's clothes, and passed as cabin boys or junior crew. You'd be surprised how often it worked. At sea, where no one bathed regularly and everyone wore rags, it wasn't as difficult as you'd imagine. One such figure, known only as Sam, sailed for nearly a year under a false identity before being discovered during a storm. By then, even some of the crew respected him. Survival by camouflage, part bravery, part madness, part genius. There's a strange kind of power in desperation. It makes ordinary people extraordinary. You can almost feel it pulsing through these stories. Women who learn to navigate the narrow line between obedience and defiance. Smile when you must strike, when you can endure always. It's a strategy older than history itself, one that every oppressed soul has understood instinctively. Even among the pirates, cracks began to show. Some men, perhaps ashamed, turned a blind eye to small acts of rebellion. Others even helped quietly sneaking food-loosening chains. It doesn't make them heroes, but it makes them human. The sea, for all its cruelty, sometimes reminded people that they were still capable of conscience. There's an odd calm to this defiance. No grand speeches, no sword fights under the moon, just survival in slow motion. You think of it like a candle burning under glass. The flame flickers, never blazing, but never going out either. Each small act, a song, a prayer, a glance was its own rebellion. The pirates might have owned the ship, but they never owned the women's will. Modern historians sometimes struggle with this part of pirate history because it doesn't fit neatly into the legend. We like our stories simple villains and heroes good and evil. But real history isn't polite. Sometimes resistance is quiet. Sometimes it's just enduring another sunrise. You picture one woman standing at the edge of the deck, her wrists still bruised, staring at the horizon as if trying to memorize it. The ocean stretches endlessly ahead, terrifying and beautiful all at once. You imagine what she must be thinking. If the sea can be free, why not me? And maybe that's the heart of it. These women weren't just victims of piracy. They were witnesses to its contradictions. Proof that even in the darkest corners of history, defiance can exist without victory. Sometimes, Just staying alive was enough to humiliate the monsters who tried to erase them. Picture this. You finally reach land, thinking the nightmare is over. The sails are furled, the guns are quiet, and the scent of salt fades into something that smells almost like safety spices smoke whetstone. But then you realize the horror doesn't end at the shore. It just changes costumes. The ship glides into a bustling Caribbean port, maybe Tortuga, maybe Port Royal, and the pirates swagger off deck like kings returning from war. The women, though, don't step onto land as survivors. They arrive as inventory. You watch as they're herded toward taverns, brothels, and markets where human suffering is converted into currency faster than gold dust. The ports that history likes to romanticize as pirate havens were really open-air economies of vice. Sailors, traders, governors, and even churchmen turned blind eyes because everyone profited somehow. The line between pirate and politician blurred quicker than rum on a hot day. In some cases, women were sold, officially written into ledgers, as indentured servants or comforters. Other times they were gifted to allies, smugglers, or local elites who provided safe harbors to the pirate fleet. It's not unlike the way corruption works today. Everything looks legal if you write it down the right way. A paper, a stamp, a signature, and suddenly horror becomes commerce. In port taverns, these women were forced into lives that historians politely call entertainment. You can almost hear the music, the drunken singing, the clinking of mugs. But behind every song, there's a transaction. Pirates might call them wenches or companions, but the truth is colder, they were collateral. A reminder that power doesn't just conquer, it recycles. Some women were sent to plantations, forced into domestic labor for the same men who had financed the pirates in the first place. Others ended up in what you could call the shadow market hidden houses, where sailors went to forget the war and where no one ever asked for names. The ones who survived longest weren't necessarily the strongest. They were the ones who learned how to negotiate humanity in a place that didn't recognize it. You wander through the port, imagining the chaos carts rolling over cobblestone's gulls, crying overhead sailors shouting prices. Every scent screams that this is a city alive, but beneath the noise there's an invisible silence, the silence of people whose voices no longer matter. The women learn to blend in, to smile when required, to vanish when convenient. You realize that pirates weren't the only villains here. Civilization, with its courts and markets and pews, was just a better-dressed accomplice. Even more haunting are the official documents that survived. British and Dutch colonial archives mention native women taken by rovers and now serving in households. That's how history hid the horror in polite language. Words like taken serving settled. Bureaucratic vocabulary designed to erase pain. It's astonishing how cruelty can sound so tidy when written in ink. Some pirates grew rich enough to retire buying small estates or taverns where they kept the same women, who once were their captives, now renamed as wives or maids. The world on land gave them the respect the ocean never did. You might wonder, how could society accept it easy? They didn't ask questions. The ports ran on profit, not morality. And every so often, one woman escaped. She'd vanish into the jungle or stow away on another ship or start anew in some distant colony under a false name. You can't help but root for them, the unknown heroines who refuse to let history end their story. There's something quietly triumphant about imagining one of them outsmarting the men who thought they owned her. By now, the myth of pirates as romantic rebels feels absurd. The truth was closer to a network of exploitation dressed up as adventure. The ports were their boardrooms, the taverns their negotiation tables, and the women the silent shareholders in a business built on despair. As night falls over, the harbor lanterns flicker along the docks. You watch one woman linger by the water, her reflection trembling on the black surface. Ships sway gently in the tide, ready for another voyage. She stares out at them, not in longing, but in understanding. She knows now land and sea were never opposites. They were just two sides of the same coin, flipped by men who always made sure it landed in their favor. You'd think, after all, that there'd be no kindness left to find in this story. But history, ever the trickster, always hides contradictions in its darkest corners. Even among the monsters, there were moments, small, flickering moments, when someone remembered they were human. The myths call them merciful pirates, and while that sounds like an oxymoron, those rare exceptions remind you that cruelty was a choice, not a rule. Take, for instance, the curious case of Captain Samuel Bellamy, the so-called Robin Hood of the seas. Legend says he forbade his crew from harming captives, especially women, declaring that pirates should fight for freedom, not oppression. Of course, that didn't stop others from ignoring his orders. But for a fleeting moment, decency had a voice aboard the Wida galley. He treated his prisoners with something resembling respect, allowing them to walk the deck, even dine with the crew. It's unsettling how remarkable basic humanity sounds when surrounded by savagery. Then there were the women who became pirates themselves. Anne Bonnie Mary Red, Grace O'Malley. Their stories are tangled between fact and myth, but what's undeniable is that they shattered the script. They weren't captives. They were captains in their own right, cutting through the expectations of their time with as much precision as any blade. Imagine the shock of the crew when they realized the fearless fighter beside them wasn't a man at all. It must have felt like seeing history glitch in real time. Still, even these women were exceptions, anomalies in a sea of suffering. For every Mary Read who fought back there were hundreds whose names were never recorded. It's almost as if the ocean itself conspired to keep their voices drowned. That's the thing about mercy. It never had good public relations. Violence, on the other hand, always knew how to advertise itself. You walk through these stories like ruins, broken fragments of kindness scattered among centuries of cruelty. Some pirates genuinely believed in codes of conduct, swearing oaths before raids not to harm women or priests. Others took pity on captives and let them go at the next port, risking mutiny for the sake of conscience. One logbook even tells of a crew that voted to release all their prisoners after a single woman began singing hymns during a storm. They called it divine intervention. Maybe it was. Or maybe guilt just sounds better when you put it to music. Even so, mercy often came tangled in contradictions. A pirate might protect a captive only to keep her for himself. Another might show kindness one day, and cruelty the next, the sea moodier than any conscience. History rarely gives us clean heroes. Instead, it offers complicated people constantly negotiating between survival and soul. You can't help comparing it to today, how even in modern times, people excuse harm by saying it was different back then, as if morality has an expiration date. The pirate age is long gone, but that defense still floats around, buoyed by the same cowardice that once sailed under black flags. And yet the existence of those rare merciful moments matters. They prove that not everyone surrendered to darkness. That even in a world built on fear, a few souls refuse to become entirely hollow. Maybe that's why Anne Bonny, before her execution, supposedly told her lover, "If you had fought like a man, you needn't be hanged like a dog." It wasn't just an insult. It was a final act of defiance, a reminder that dignity doesn't die quietly. Mercy, in those rare flashes, was rebellion. It was the refusal to let the ocean's violence define every heartbeat on deck. It didn't redeem the pirate age, but it punctured the myth that's enough. Because once you know that some men could choose compassion, you can no longer pretend that cruelty was inevitable. As dawn breaks over the horizon, the water glows gold, almost holy. You realize the same sea that carried nightmares also carried mercy, fragile but afloat. It didn't erase the horror, but it reminded the world that goodness, though small, never truly vanished. It just had to fight harder to stay above water. By the time the cannons rust and the flags fade, you'd think the story would finally rest. But history has a bad habit of burying the truth beneath romance. The pirates are long gone, yet the legends that replace them wear such shiny armor you'd hardly guess what those wooden decks once held. The songs, the movies, the Halloween costumes, they all skip the part where the laughter came at someone else's expense. When the golden age of piracy ended, the survivors, the ones who'd endured captivity, faced a new enemy silence. Returning home should have been the end of the nightmare, but society rarely welcomes back the broken. Some women found their families had moved on, ashamed of what had happened, unwilling to take them in. Others tried to rebuild lives under new names, carrying memories heavier than any anchor. It's cruelly ironic those who were wronged became the ones who had to apologize. You can imagine it, a woman stepping off a ship, years after her capture, skin weathered by salt eyes, hollow but alive. She tells her story, and people look away. They whisper words like shame, dishonor, bad luck. No one wants reminders that evil didn't always wear a uniform. So she stops speaking. She fades into history's background, one more ghost of the sea. The official records hardly mention them. Chronicles list cargo, gold, mutinies, storms, but not the names of the lost. And when later generations romanticized piracy, the women disappeared entirely. The dashing outlaw, the adventurous rogue, that's the version people preferred. The truth was too inconvenient, too messy for bedtime tales. It's strange how society edits its own memory like an overzealous writer, trimming out all the uncomfortable paragraphs. Every now and then, you stumble on fragments, a parish register listing unknown woman deceased at sea, or a sailor's diary hinting at unpleasant business. That's how historians know these women existed at all, through the margins. You start to realize history doesn't forget people. It just decides who's worth remembering. And denial didn't die with the pirates. Even centuries later, scholars debated whether stories of captured women were exaggerated, as though thousands of missing names could be explained away as rumor. It's a familiar pattern. Doubt the victims, defend the myth. You can see the same logic echoing through other chapters of history: wars, colonies, conquests. The scenery changes. The script doesn't. What's worse, popular culture revived the pirates as anti-heroes. They became symbols of rebellion, independence, freedom, the very things they stole from others. It's not that the legends are wrong. They're just incomplete. The problem isn't in celebrating the daring, it's in forgetting the cost. Every yo-ho-ho came from a deck scrubbed clean of screams. Every treasure map ignored the lives buried beside the gold. You think of those survivors who lived long enough to see pirates executed, some even testified at trials. One record from Jamaica mentions a woman who stood before the court, her voice steady as she identified her captors. The judge wrote that she showed remarkable composure. What he didn't write was what it cost her to achieve it. Sometimes, justice came in strange forms. A few pirates begged forgiveness before hanging, claiming they'd been misled by temptation. Others laughed to the end unrepentant. But the truth is, no punishment could undo the centuries of silence that followed. The women weren't just victims of pirates. They were victims of the world's eagerness to forget. You can almost feel history's smirk in the way museums display pirate flags and pistols, but never mention the human toll. Even school children grow up thinking of piracy as adventure, not atrocity. You might wonder how many more stories are still waiting at the bottom of the ocean, trapped beneath shipwrecks and coral whispering through the current. And maybe that's the real tragedy, not just what was done, but how easily it was erased. The sea didn't just swallow bodies, it swallowed accountability. Every wave that breaks against the shore sounds a little like applause for a lie we're still telling ourselves. You see the skull and crossbones on a beach towel, and it smiles like a joke that forgot the punchline. You pause, because once you've heard the real story, the grin feels wrong, like laughter in a church during a thunderstorm. You wander a modern harbor, where yacht masts ping in a friendly breeze, and souvenir shops spill plastic cutlasses into the sunlight. A child begs for a pirate hat. A parent shrugs and buys two. If only they could feel the hush that used to live under those same sails, the hush you met when the black flag rose, when the quartermaster's ledger skipped a line where a name should have been. The sea is calm today, but memory is tidal. It returns and sets. It brings back the division of plunder, the paper-thin codes, the performative marriages, the airless hold. You can almost hear that below-deck lullaby, cut short mid-note, the one that taught you how silence can be a shield and a wound at the same time. Tour guides love a good story, and pirates make easy theater. But if you stand far enough from the crowd, you notice which parts they lower their voices for or skip completely. They linger on buried treasure, glide past buried lives. They quote swagger, not sobs. You start counting the edits like notches in a mast. Have we learned to love the mask more than the face? A little question for the comment section of your mind. Museums help when they're brave. You step into one with creaking floors and glass cases filled with pistols, coins greened by seawater, a compass that refuses to point to anything but profit. On one wall, a map of port economies connects dotted lines between taverns, governors, and privateers who behaved like pirates with diplomacy. On another, a quiet exhibit, unrecorded lives at sea. It's just a bench, a ledger copied in facsimile, a list of taken women reduced to initials and tallies. No melodrama, just handwriting. Sometimes ink hits harder than cannon shot. You remember the exceptions, the Bellamy rumor, the oath-breakers who tried decency for a day, the women who disguised themselves, the storm songs that disarmed a crew. Those moments don't excuse anything. They indict it. If compassion was possible, then cruelty was chosen. That's the equation that won't stop ringing like a ship's bell in your ears. Out on the pier, a bronze statue watches the water, not a captain with a saber, but a figure seated eyes level with the horizon, hands open but not empty. Her presence is quiet, which feels exactly right. You read the small plaque, no names, just a sentence about those who were carried without consent across these waters. someone has tucked a sprig of rosemary at the base. The wind flips it like a page. Do you leave a coin, a flower, or just your attention? Attention costs the least and changes the most. There's a temptation to say, different times. You've heard that in every century. But harbors still hum with versions of the same trade, just with better paperwork and more polite lighting. Port economies still find ways to make people vanish into services and arrangements, words that sound like velvet but cut like rope. If the past teaches anything, it's how euphemism becomes armor. Maybe the better question is, what do we call things today so we don't have to feel them? And what would happen if we stopped translating pain into policy language? You walk past a cafe where a black flag logo winks from a chalkboard beside the espresso specials. It's catchy branding. It always has been. The Jolly Roger was a marketing department before marketing had departments. Fear was the product surrendered the subscription. The add-on, as you learned, was human. Now the logo sells lattes, but symbols don't lose their original weight just because we set them down for a while. Pick one up, and you might hear the clink of a long-ago share, a captain's first pick, the crowd's sly relief when possession passed for protection. History, when told as bedtime, ought to help you sleep with both eyes wider open. So try this. Next time you see a costume aisle, ask yourself what the story leaves behind. Next time you watch a sword fight on screen, listen for the quiet below deck. Next time you hear a shanty, wait for the verse that never made it into the chorus. Interactive question for you? If you could add one plaque to a harbor, you know what would it say and where would you set it so no one could dodge it on their morning jog? There's also the work of repair. Some places have begun to fund research into ship manifests, parish burials, and court testimonies looking for the edges of those erased lives. Community historians map the shadow market that tied sea to shore, tracing how taverns, estates, and magistrates turned suffering into civic revenue. It's unspectacular labor, dust microfilm ink stains, but it lifts forgotten names like pearls from silt. And once a name surfaces, denial can't breathe as easily. You think back to the first moment the wind died and the black sails arrived, how the sea seemed to hold its breath the way a room does when truth steps through the door. If stories can glamorize, they can also disinfect. We don't unremember by accident. We choose clarity the way a captain chooses a course. And we correct like navigators, note the drift mark, a new bearing, keep checking the stars. The moral ones, not the shiny ones. Someone on the pier laughs the good kind, the kind that fits inside a sunny day. It doesn't sound wrong anymore. Laughter can live with truth so long as it stops pretending to be its replacement. You picture the women who learned to smile in order to survive, then learned to stop smiling when survival finally meant saying no. If there's any monument they might want, it's probably this: fewer myths, more memory, fewer costumes, more names, fewer skulls, more faces. As the afternoon light goes honey soft, you watch a small sailboat tack across the bay, its wake sketching a white line that vanishes almost as soon as it appears. That's how most lives move through history, brief, bright, erased by the next wave. But every so often a line holds. A song unfinished finds a harmony. A ledger with initials becomes a wall with full names. A souvenir flag becomes a lesson you don't put back on the rack. You don't need to hate every pirate story. You just need to insist on the chapters that were cut. And if a child tugs your sleeve tomorrow and asks for a pirate tale, you can still tell one. Just keep the lantern low and the voice gentle, the way you do when you want someone to hear everything. Start with the wind, the sails, the thrill. Then let the deck creak. Let the code flutter. Let the marriage reveal its trap. Let the hold breathe. Let the resistance spark. Let the port whisper its prices. Let rare mercy flicker. And finally let the waves remember what the ledgers tried to forget. That way, when you reach the last line, the sea will sound different. Still beautiful, still dangerous, but honest for once. And honesty is the only harbor large enough for everyone who crossed it. Tonight, you've drifted through black sails, thin codes, forced marriages, the airless hold the quiet rebellions, and the ports that turn suffering into neat ledgers. You've learned that legends skip the cost, but memory can set the record steady like a compass finding north after storms. Let the sea grow soft again. Let names return like distant buoys blinking in patient rhythm. Breathe in the salt of truth. Breathe out the noise of myth. The hull stops creaking, the lantern dims, the tide keeps time. You are safe on shore now. Close your eyes. We remember. You can rest tonight.